Welcome, everybody. This is Lessons from the Field, and this is, of course, a series of interviews that we do with a diverse array of guests who have a common thread, and that is a passion for pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences. Today, we're very fortunate to be featuring Yijia Lu, who is a graduate of our PharmD program from 2015. She's also a certified regulatory affairs professional and is senior manager for global regulations and strategy at Cerevel Therapeutics in Boston. So I'll be asking Yijia some questions, and from those questions and answers, hopefully our guests will provide insight for our students, alumni, and anyone else listening on her career and experience that will benefit all of us. So thank you in advance, Dr. Lu, for being here with us today. Let's just start with, if you could just briefly kind of walk us through what you've been doing since you left UIC, and then we'll ask you next to tell us a little bit more detail about your current position.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start off by saying thanks, Dean Schumock, for inviting me to do this. I'm very excited to be here. So it's been about 6 years since I've graduated, so not too much career to cover through, so it'll be relatively short there. Since I graduated, I did a 2-year industry fellowship with Takeda Pharmaceuticals and Purdue University, and the fellowship was in global regulatory affairs. This was when Takeda still had the majority of their operations based out of the Chicagoland area, so I would spend most of my time with Takeda in their regulatory group, and then I would drive down to Purdue for my academic duties. So the sunset of my fellowship, I finished out in Boston. That was when Takeda decided to move some of its R&D operations, and arguably now Boston land area is probably the #1 city for all things pharma, biotech, R&D related. So shortly after the fellowship there, I'm very lucky that the stars have aligned post-fellowship. Takeda had a position that was open, and it was in neuroscience. And neuroscience has been one of my favorite therapeutic areas going through school. So I was able to stay on with my parent company, stayed at Takeda for 3 years, developed my skill sets, grew as a person as well. I've expanded the fellowship program there, and then I left. It was time for a new adventure. And now I'm at Cerevel Therapeutics, which is a small biotech. So it's been about a year and a half now, and it's a company purely focused on neuroscience.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, it's really great to see what you've done. I wanted to ask you, before I ask you the next question, which is about kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis, but when you were at UIC, did you have, were you interested in industry all along and regulatory affairs, or how did you make that transition?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that, and I always explain it as it's very much a stepping stone type of a journey. I went into pharmacy school only knowing about Walgreens and CVS, so your traditional retail route. I also knew about lab bench research, and I had this master plan of going into pharmacognosy and doing research and combining Eastern and Western medicine. And so you know what happens when you make plans? Life tends to laugh at you. So as I went through UIC pharmacy, I'm very fortunate to have Dr. Popovich as my advisor, and he really encouraged me to try out different things. And that was what I did. So I explored retail and research and clinical, and eventually found my way to industry because I really wanted to be more on the proactive side and really trying to understand how drugs were developed. Rather than be on the more clinical side and the managed care side. I wanted to figure out how drugs were developed and approved. And so that was how I eventually found my way to industry towards the end of my P3 year. So right at the, the edge of selecting rotations.
Okay, I see. Great. Well, so now you're in regulatory affairs, and what do you do on a day-to-day basis, just so the students who might be interested kind of have an idea of what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take a step back and say that regulatory affairs is a pretty large bucket, and sometimes pharma in general can be quite nebulous. Not many people talk about it, and they say it takes a village. I like to joke that it takes a city to get a drug approved. And so for regulatory affairs, I'm specifically under regulatory strategy. So arguably then also a bit more nebulous than regulatory affairs because there are, I like to explain it as there are two parts to my role. One is an external facing role in which that we're the department that talks to FDA and all the other countries' FDAs. So anything that leaves the company to FDA has to pass through our desks. And we have to know what's happening. Then internally facing, we in regulatory strategy need to be on top of all the different regulations, all the guidances, what the precedents are, so we can properly guide our team so that we can shepherd along a compound so that we're not wasting anybody's time, we're not wasting money, and we're trying to get it out to patients as fast as possible, but as safe as possible. So with that preamble, I don't really have a typical week. I'll say that the amount of meetings I have ebbs and flows, but because my role is so overarching, I'm constantly in various types of meetings because I need to be aware of what's happening on a day-to-day level at clinical trials that we're running and conducting, but we're also trying to plan 10 years ahead of when we're going to wrap up phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and ultimately filing, and then we have post-commitment, post-approval commitment. So, and then you try to Tetris everything together. So certainly a lot of meetings, a lot of downtime. You have to do a lot of reading and stay on top of what's happening out there. So if you'd like to, I usually tell students, if you like to talk to people, if you like to work together as a team setting, because drug development is a team sport, regulatory, that's what usually my typical week is like.
Sounds good. So yeah, you've kind of hit on some of the things that you like about regulatory. It does sound like, you know, for some people that would really be an exciting role because of all of the, you know, different new regulations that are coming out and having to stay on top of what those are, but also what's happening within the company. Is there other things about regulatory that either drew you to it or have kept you you know, interested?
Yeah, I love regulatory in that no day is ever the same. You can work on 2 investigational new drug applications for a very similar mechanism of action, right? If you're looking at a honeycomb structure and one arm is different, you're going to have 2 vastly different experiences when you talk to FDA and put the package together. Ultimately, regulatory affairs, I love it because it's the combination of altruism. I love to help people. It's the answer I gave when I applied to pharmacy school. I love my patients. So altruism is really a part of it, but also it's a great cross-section for altruism, science, law, and business. So all things together.
Great. Well, you've already, I think, answered the next question too, which I was going to ask you, which is about the challenges or, you know, most rewarding parts of your job. Is there anything else you'd want to add to that?
I'll add that if you like problem solving, consider regulatory strategy. It's about, I like to also make Tetris into a verb and say that it's a lot of Tetrising and making sure that pieces fall together, and you have to be creative as well. So it's challenging and very much rewarding.
So what advice would you have for students who might be interested in either regulatory or other careers within industry? Because obviously there's lots of other, you know, departments and focus points within industry that students are interested in and go into. But as they're preparing and trying to be competitive for either internships or fellowships after they graduate, you know, what advice would you have for our students who are interested in this?
Yeah, I say this to all students, doesn't matter if they're interested in industry or retail or clinical or any other path that they might be looking into, is ask questions and soul search. And those 2 you have to constantly do. You ask more questions, you reach out, you network, and you don't know what you don't know. And as a student, you have the luxury of exploring different opportunities. The downside to that luxury is that you have a finite amount of time. So not to add pressure to anything, but as a student, you know, you're concerned about your grades, your semester, your 4 years, you're thinking about a job and getting a paycheck. But while you're in school, take advantage of, people who come through the Dean's Forum. I really enjoyed that class when I took it. So don't be shy. You don't know what you don't know, just ask questions, and then really soul search and try things out and figure out what are your strengths and weaknesses. Even if you try something that you don't like, now you realize what you don't like, and that will help you.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Dean's Forum. Thanks for that little pitch. Was there, what were there other things at UIC that help prepare you for what you're doing now, or just if you, as you look back on your time here, what was it that you think either you'd advise people to take advantage of or get experience in, other than what you've already mentioned?
Yeah, so at UIC, a few things come to mind. I would say, piggybacking off of what I said before with asking questions, one is just to try to get experience working. I know that's a very blanket statement, but there are so many transferable skills that will help you in the future. So there's that one piece. But specifically about UIC, there are two things that I think that have really helped me in my role of regulatory affairs and regulatory strategy. One, I think UIC does really well is having a focus on patients. So that patient centricity, when I'm reading through a draft protocol for a clinical trial, I always have the patient in mind, even if it is for healthy volunteers and we're really concerned about trying to figure out how the body, right, PK, PD, and I'm always thinking of, well, are we drawing too much blood? Is this too many PK draws? So always trying to focus on what it's like to be on the other side, that empathy. Truly, UIC does a great job in making sure that their students always think of the patient. The second piece is really the clinical aspects, which many people I think would be surprised to find out about. There is a clinical aspect of regulatory strategy. I think to be a successful regulatory strategist, you truly need to be able to understand what is happening. So going back to what I was saying before, where everything comes through our desk before it goes to FDA. And if FDA has a question, they call you and everyone's logged off because it's Friday at 5:45. You might be able to answer the question. So really be able to stay on top of the science UIC has done quite a bit. There were also times where when you're in rare disease or in a disease that nobody has no idea anything of. In my past life, I was able to support this rare disease called Kabuki syndrome. And no one knew anything about it. It hasn't even really been published. It was first came out in the early 1990s. There's 2 experts in the world. And so really putting on that clinical critical thinking hat, digging through, trying to understand the disease state, keeping the patient in mind, helps quite a bit with drug development.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. So I know we have a variety of people that listen to this. I mean, it's our students, obviously, but also recent graduates and even, alumni, maybe from your class. So you shout out to your class, 2015. And I know you're still very young in your career, but do you have advice for folks as they're starting their careers, and whether it's specific to work or maybe the work-life balance? You've given us some great tips already, but is there any additional thoughts that you have for the audience?
Yes, and this might be, so I'll cheat and say there's 2 parts. Part 1 for success, I would say, is to actually take a step back to identify what success means, because everyone defines it differently. And that definition can change, and that's okay if it changes, but keep a pulse and check the temperature. What does success actually mean? Whether you want to split it and say, this is what success means for me in work, this is my definition of success in life. And then part 2 of it, and I know you said work-life balance, so unpopular opinion from me is that I don't truly believe there's a work-life balance. Maybe I'll change my mind soon, but I like to believe in work-life Jenga. Because work-life Jenga.
Oh, so Jenga. Okay, that's what I thought you said.
Yeah. And so I like that better than work-life balance, because balance is hard to achieve with everything. And in life, we know that sometimes one will take priority over the other. And so every block can mean something, and things will trade off on priority list. And sometimes the tower might wobble a little bit, and that's okay. Sometimes the tower might completely topple over, but you reset and you start over. So that's, I would say, my two tips for success is really, one, to identify what it means, and two, we're all in it. We're all trying to figure out this balance slash, I like to call it Jenga. But and that's okay. You chug along and just keep going.
Yeah, wow, that's a good one. Work-life Jenga. That'll be the
I'll
title.
catch
You have to, I think you're gonna have to trademark that one or something, get a patent going. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me today, Yijia. It's really great catching up, and we'll have to have you back for the Dean's Forum if you're willing to do that, or some of the other events that we have. But thank you again, and I think all of your comments here are going to be really helpful to our students and others. So appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much again for opportunity. Happy to come back for Dean's Forum or anything else.
Next time we'll make it in person.
Sounds good.